Well, again, we are so happy you all are here. I am Diane Gould. I am a clinical social worker, and I am the founder and executive director of PDA North America. And Brooke, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Brooke Madeira. I have a number of social media platforms where I create content under the name No Pressure PDA. Just a tiny bit about me. I'm a parent. I'm a PDA adult. I have three PDA kids, and I just write and create lots of stuff. And I'm gonna actually have a book published with Sally Cat's PDA page that should be coming out next year, from an insider's perspective on the PDA profile. So that's pretty exciting.
Very exciting.
Mhm.
Very exciting. So we're going to cram a lot of information, Brooke and I are, and this next hour. And when I'm trying to understand things, I like to know the history. That helps my brain. So I just quickly want to go over that for you all. So in the 1980s in the UK, there was a psychologist, Elizabeth Newson, who was diagnosing many kids as autistic. And she noticed this subgroup of autistic kids who were different than the majority of the kids she was diagnosing, but very much like each other. And the thing that stood out to her the most was that they just couldn't help avoiding everyday demands. And she thought she would name this group um, PDA, pathological demand avoidant kids or avoidance, and thought she was, really doing everyone a favor. And she picked the word pathological on purpose because she wanted people to know that they just couldn't help it, that they weren't making a conscious decision to avoid things. Now we kind of wish she hadn't choose the word pathological, but hadn't chosen the word pathological. So it still took a while in the UK for people to talk about PDA after that. So there was a parent group in 97. PDA was mentioned for the first time in the UK on their kind of national autistic site, which is like our, Autism Society of America. So that was 2008. Some research started being done in 2010. And the first book on PDA came out in 2011. It's still a great book, Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance in Children by Phil Christie and Ruth Fidler. 2020, 2013 was the first PDA awareness day, and 2014 is when the PDA Society was formed and their website was launched. And PDA Society is still kind of the international go-to organization. They've been very helpful to us getting started. So I think like anything that's ever happened in the world of disability, it started with a mom who wouldn't take no for an answer. And I had a client who discovered PDA and thought it fit her son and sent me article after article about PDA until I really paid attention. And the information really resonated with me for many reasons. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get trained in PDA. Found someone to train me in the UK, and pretty quickly into that training, we thought, all right, let's have a workshop. We'll have one in Chicago. We'll see if anyone comes, and if not, we'll go shopping and go to all the good restaurants in Chicago. But people did come. We had 165 people come to Chicago in March 2020. And if that date rings a bell, it's because that's when the pandemic started. And we got everyone home, including our speakers from the UK, on the last flights. The world shutting down gave me an opportunity to launch a website. Now it's better than the original website, but it's still up. And that's the one that you all can find all kinds of information on. We have in person, we have a annual conference that gets bigger every year. We have just started regional workshops. So people watching this, give some thought if you want to reach out and talk about a workshop where you live. We have lots of virtual offerings. We have webinars, sometimes even 3 times a month, and live Q&As. We have support groups, and we have trainings for parents and professionals. We have tons of resources, the Affirming Provider page, insights like blogs, all kinds of things. In the start of 2023, it seemed like the right time to become a nonprofit, and we have done that. So we've been a nonprofit about 2 years now, which is really exciting. And last year, I wrote a book with Ruth Fiedler on navigating PDA in America. So now we have an actual book for Americans on the topic of PDA, which is something I wanted to have, because before that, all the books were from the UK. So to start this presentation, Brooke and I wanted to talk about that not all demand avoidance is PDA. Now, as the awareness of PDA has grown so drastically, we think it's good to point out that people can avoid demands and not be PDA, because there's lots of reasons people avoid demand. And some people are autistic and they avoid lots of demands, but they're not PDA. And sometimes people avoid demands because they're perfectionists, or they have executive functioning challenges, or they're just really anxious, sensory sensitivities, perfectionism, OCD, all kinds of reasons. So not all demand avoidance is PDA. And Brooke's going to talk a little bit more about that. Ooh.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it wouldn't let me unmute myself.
Oh.
So yeah, I created a resource a while back where I was kind of categorizing, different styles of avoidances that I didn't consider PDA, and it was pretty popular. So this is my version of that, where just, you can kind of look over this more closely when you get the slideshow. But just to show that, ADHD has its own avoidances. ADHD people tend to, be easily distractible, or looking for, driven by novelty and interest, or some executive functioning struggles. Also, trauma has its own, just a lot of the same things, that Diane just pointed out. And then autism in general, whether you're PDA or not PDA, has things that look like avoidances that aren't necessarily. So, if I'm really intensely focused on something and someone interrupts me, they might interpret that my avoidance of their questions or desires for me to do things as being avoidance, when really I'm just focused on something else. You can go to next slide. And then also, as Diane mentioned, there's extreme demand avoidance, which happens when an autistic person is unsupported, and they're just burned out. They need rest and, proper autistic supports. So, or saying all these things that PDA is not. So what exactly is it then? We're still kind of working out the correct way to describe some of these things, but these are some that people resonate with. How we're spoken to can be triggering for us. So a lot of times, with non-PDA autism, tone of voice is actually not really something that seems to be cared about as much. But for us, tone of voice can be incredibly triggering. Sometimes just being too obvious, trying to tell us things that we already know. That's irritable to everybody, but we can be extremely sensitive to feeling like we're being told something we should already know. Wanting things too badly, that's a weird one, but it's very common with PDA kids and adults that we can be triggered by our own desires if we get too excited. And feeling over-prepared, that one's kind of unique. So typically with autism, being prepared is great, can't go wrong with that. PDA, you can just tip over the line where you go from helping prepare someone for something to them feeling like they know too much, and it's like makes the thing feel bigger and is triggering, and we want to avoid it. Trust is a very big factor. Again, all human beings require trust to function well, but it just seems to be a very, just much more sensitive for PDA people. And then the feeling of being trusted can also be triggering, as well as the feeling of being observed. So this is where it gets kind of tricky, which we'll go on to talk about, but it can be tricky to diagnose, tricky for trying to convince others that your kid is PDA, because as soon as they're observed, their behavior can change. So, all right, go ahead.
People are
Um,
often, oh,
oh,
oh, sorry,
it's
no.
got my face, but if you want to talk, go for it.
No, oh gosh, I'm so used to doing everything alone. I need to learn to share.
That's okay. That's okay. This is
Working.
your slide, in all fairness. So you can add on to what I'd say. But there was a population study done in the UK to determine, just how prevalent is PDA. It was done on autistic, I'm assuming, right? Diagnosed autistic people. And it was shown to be in about 1 of 25. So a pretty small minority. But keep in mind, this is only an estimate, and my experience and Diane's experience is that oftentimes PDA people are hiding in other misdiagnoses, especially because of the PDA social strategies component, which again, we'll talk kind of more about that, but you can find us in a lot of ODD diagnoses, oppositional defiant disorder, DMDD, just anxiety, sometimes generalized anxiety, which I've been diagnosed with before. And sometimes just if they just see the ADHD, that's all they'll get. So anyway, it's just we're out there. I think so. So did you want to add anything, Dan?
No, just there's lots of people who fit the PDA profile who are not diagnosed correctly,
Mm-hmm.
especially people that are not who don't have the resources to be diagnosed, or accessing our healthcare systems, or
Mm-hmm.
just viewed as behavioral, and having
Right.
difficult.
Yeah, that's the thing. We tend to get more of the bad parenting assumptions, because if you don't fit the typical autism presentation, then that's just blown right past, and all the struggles are, you know, piled onto the parenting. So,
Right, right. And when I started kind of in 2020, one of the things that really stood out to me was I was getting calls and emails from families all over the country, and they said such similar things that it really surprised me and blew me away. And parents talked about having this light bulb moment when they heard about PDA, that everything all of a sudden made sense, and that their child may have had many different diagnoses, but the parents felt that none of them really fit, and their gut always told them something was missing. Because parents are great at doing their own research and are so motivated, many parents came to the belief that their child was autistic and would take their child to one or two or three psychological assessments, and were told that their child couldn't be autistic because she was so socially motivated and interested in friends, or their child couldn't be motivated because he was so imaginative, or their child couldn't be autistic because they made eye contact so easily. And that is something we're working to change. And probably the hardest thing to hear from almost every parent was how hard they worked to follow the advice they were given by teachers, educators, and other educators and therapists, and even parenting books, but none of it worked with their children. And sometimes it even made things harder. I'm going to share now. It's your side. You can't unmute. Okay, I'll talk while you
maybe I'll just quit muting myself in general. I did it because I didn't know if my kids would interrupt. So, we'll just keep that in mind. So, what's in the name? As Diane alluded to, there are many within the PDA community that are not crazy about the term pathological. So there's this preference for another term, pervasive drive for autonomy. There's also been, suggested persistent drive for autonomy. There's no blanket. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense that PDA people tend to struggle with whatever they're getting named and like to have, their own name that they feel most comfortable with. So just keeping that in mind that there's different ways to view it and to name it. Go ahead.
And the best way is to just ask people,
Oh, and yeah, just ask people.
you know, what's your preference?
Mhm.
So in my first phone call to Ruth Fiddler, where I was getting up the courage to ask her if she'd write a book with me, I just started with asking her, telling her I wanted to learn about PDA and if she could kind of help me with that. And she interrupted me in a very polite British way and said that we couldn't really talk about PDA until we talked about autism, because in America we have such a old-fashioned, stereotypical, outdated view of autism, and we have to understand autism first before we can understand PDA. And it's not what I expected, and I was really taken aback because I had a long list of questions about PDA. But now I'm so grateful that she brought this up. It's changed so much for me. And one of the books that I especially like, and everyone has to find what they like, but I liked Dr. Devin Price's book, Unmasking Autism, because he talks about more subtle characteristics of autistic people, about like being hyper reactive to even small stimuli in the environment, or having trouble distinguishing between information and sensory data that should be ignored versus data that should be carefully considered. And I think one of the important things he talks about is that processing a situation takes more time and energy than it does a non-autistic person. And I think those of you who are supporting or parenting or working with a PDAer see this all the time, just how tiring life can be. And then Donna Henderson, Sarah Wayland, and Jamel White wrote a fabulous book, Is This Autism? And I just love kind of the straightforwardness and the simplicity of what they say about autism. So being autistic at its core just means having a different kind of nervous system. And people with that kind of nervous system experience, process, and respond to the world differently than non-autistics. And I think that is really true, and something so different than what I was taught, about autism earlier in my career. What I was taught and what most people have been taught, and why sometimes it's so hard to understand how certain PDAers can be autistic, because their presentation is so different than the autism we learned. Because historically and the mainstream perception of autism is very different. Anytime there's a TV or movie character who's autistic, they have this very specific portrayal where the person, is very kind of concrete and pragmatic, and they love routines, and their social differences are so noticeable, but their empathy is not noticeable. It's a very externalized presentation with high anxiety, and these autistic people go into fight or flight mode. But a more inclusive way of looking at autistic features or characteristics is looking at, a much more internalized, less obvious profile. It's often more an existential kind of experience. There's a lot of masking and camouflage. People who fit kind of these categories, and it's the majority of autistic people, including PDAers, you know, individuals are hyper empathetic, and they also have high anxiety, but their interests fit in socially and culturally. But under threat, they're going to use more or have more kind of threat responses. So fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. So it's majority of autistic people, including PDA. So we really have to think differently about autism to understand PDA. We have to move away from this traditional view and look at it as a way of experiencing the world, not this checklist of behaviors. And I know that most schools still, to qualify a student under autism, everyone has to agree to this checklist of behaviors. And it's very unfortunate. And the PDA movement had it right in terms of gender differences all along. They looked at gender split for PDAers as 50-50, which is really the autism. It's just how we looked at autism was this very male portrayal. Since Europe is ahead in many ways, there's also a psychologist in Belgium who's done some cool work, Peter Vermeulen, and he talks about context blindness. But what I really like that he talks about is prediction differences, and if it's harder for you to hypothesize what would happen if you acquiesced, you're less likely to say yes to something you're asked or told to do and more likely to say no. So I think his work is pretty interesting. All right, Brooke's going to talk.
All right.
Here.
Christy, yeah. So just to mentioning, so Christy Forbes is, well known. I've got to know her a little bit on social media. Big following. She created Intune Pathways. She's an adult PDAer, and the way she's really reframed or made an effort to reframe, autism is not just a diagnosis, but it's best to be viewed as a different culture. And that, again, this is your slide, so I'm kind of reading into it my own things, but yeah, just to see that the positives, not just looking at it from a deficit angle, and seeing the overlap with marginalized communities. And she created Intune Pathways and offers trainings to kind of help spread that understanding. And yeah, go ahead, Diane. This is literally your slide. So
Oh, it's great. I just love that she, talks about changing and moving away from this doom and gloom narrative, about so it's she's really a groundbreaker that way too.
And it's worth mentioning, PDA isn't going to show up all by itself. I just thought of, we put this together, but I just thought of how Sally Cat did a survey a while back, and it was definitely the majority where people who identified as PDA also had, I think it was like 6 or 7 co-occurring conditions. Only a small minority, like maybe 3%, only had one. So, just to say, kind of keep on the lookout, especially, GI disorders, autoimmune disorders, sleep disorders. And some of these, even like sleep disorders, what that really means is someone who literally just has a different sleep cycle that our culture is not, come equipped to accommodate. Chronic fatigue syndrome is very common. Ehlers-Danlos. Oh, that's my child. Sorry. Keeping it real over here. So, so yeah, it's just worth mentioning. We're not just juggling, PDA struggles, but we got other things going on as well.
Yeah, and most PDAers, I think that we know, also are diagnosed as ADHD, often prior to being diagnosed with autism or anything else. So people often ask kind of how important is it to get a diagnosis? And, it's a hard one because I think you have to have access to a psychologist who really views autism in this more inclusive way, and someone who understands PDA and is willing to use a diagnosis and mention PDA and have the recommendations be PDA recommendations. And sometimes people are like halfway there. Often just the traditional screening tools aren't sensitive enough. And many PDA individuals, and we're going to talk about understanding the social world and expectations differently. People know how to act in an assessment, what is required, and often PDA individuals mask during the process, so the psychologist, the examiner, isn't seeing anything. So and says to the parent, I don't know, maybe some ADHD, I don't really see anything else. And it's expensive and a lot to go through to have these tests. So you need a psychologist who will work with you, who will really get their information from you, the parent, because it otherwise, the testing isn't going to be accurate. So I usually feel it's better not to have kind of a diagnosis than go through it, the whole process, if it's not going to be worth it. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why do you want it? And just validation is fine, to want a diagnosis for validation for yourself or your child. You just need to find the right person. And the PDA Society has a lot on their website about identifying and assessing PDA. It's not in the DSM, however, autism is. So for people, if you find a psychologist who will diagnose autism with a PDA profile, that is helpful. People ask me all the time if our goal is to get in the DSM, and it's not my favorite question because I usually say not really. Other groups, have been working on it for 30 years. It's very hard to get in. It requires having backing of the psychiatric community, which we're not there yet. And right now, since PDA is fairly new in America, we're still just building awareness, trying to get understanding and support to parents and training to professionals. So everything can't be a priority, which is one of the things we're going to talk about in supporting PDAers too. So this is probably the part some of you really want, is kind of what does PDA look like? And I'm going to start with that, because PDA individuals generally have more advanced social understanding and communication skills than many other autistic people, they can use it to their advantage and mask difficulties in processing or understanding communication in social situations. So in many ways, PDA can be a hidden disability, and PDA people, because of that, are less likely to get the support they need. So we need everyone to recognize and understand PDA, to be able to help PDAers. And of course, as in the name, part of the profile, I'm supposed to share.
That's okay.
Sharing. Sorry.
It's okay. We're sharing. I know. We're
Not
rusty.
good at it. I'm not good.
Yeah, that's all right. So yeah, some of the, common features, of course, resisting and avoiding ordinary demands of life, think sometimes eating, drinking, toileting. One of my kids, so each of my kids has a different kind of PDA look to them. They're not all the same. But one of them, he was like, can you plug in my tablet? And I kid you not, his cord was this far away from his hand and his tablet. And it wasn't, I mean, most parents or adults would be like, oh my gosh, you need to whip that kid into shape. But no, this was really a resistance, a feeling he was having. And I'll, anytime I've tried to just push them to do the things that seem so simple. Oh, and I dropped my earpiece. Anyway, anytime I try to just push them to do the things that are seemingly simple, it ends up backfiring and causing trauma and damage to our relationship. Um, as we mentioned, using social strategies as part of our avoidances, distractions, excuses, humor, doing other things instead. And we are sociable. I guess we should change the language there. We are sociable, but we do lack we do have deficits, and everybody's is going to look a little different, but there are gaps in our understanding, or we'll just miss things, certain cues sometimes, and people are wondering what's wrong with us. But it's just like blank spots. We do also experience, it's common to have changes in mood, impulsivity. This could be due to a hypervigilance, or the intensity of our emotions, and acting differently in different settings. This is a really big one. So for instance, myself as a child, spent a lot of energy at school and with my peer group, and then at home, from just the barest minimum request from my mom, I would explode and reject, anything and everything she wanted me to do. So we see that a lot with kids where, if there's too much pressure in one area, you're going to see that come out somewhere else, seemingly unrelated.
Oh, me. So
Yay.
difficulty complying with the requests of others or following routines set by others. But what's important about this group is PDAers sometimes can even make themselves do things they want to do. And that is something that really separates PDAers from other groups that I know. There's a fundamental need for control, and often, sometimes people describe that as an anxiety-based need for control. Another feature that stands out from this group in comparison to other groups is PDAers don't really appreciate hierarchy or age differences. A second grade PDAer might think it's a ridiculous stance that the principal of the school should be treated more respectfully than other second graders, that it just doesn't really make sense that people should just be treated based on hierarchy or age differences. The early work always said that PDAers didn't see hierarchy, but I think when we changed it, that they see it, they just don't think it's relevant. I kind of get that. That makes sense.
It also could be triggering. So that's another one for the PDA people who are more fawning. So if someone is an authority, that could, it's just very anxiety inducing.
Right.
So
yeah, that makes sense to me too. Many PDAers are really comfortable in role play and pretend. Not all, but many. And PDAers might use role play and pretend to avoid demands, but they also might use it to comply with demands. And like other autistic people, PDAers can be obsessive. However, with PDAers, it's more likely to be focused on people than on objects. So it could be, a movie star or singer or historical person, or it could be the kid who sits next to them in language arts. And that one can be problematic and impact social relationships. And if especially a child is obsessive about a peer. They might not want the other person to play with other kids, and only play with them. And that can be problematic, of course. And this grows in intensity when they're feeling anxious. Also, sometimes it can work the other way, where a PDA has a very strong dislike for someone too. But PDAers, one of the reasons they don't get diagnosed often is that when they're feeling confident, they're so charismatic and engaging and social, which is something that makes people think they can't be autistic. PDAers are so sensitive that they can easily absorb the emotions around them. So if you are a little frustrated with them, or just in general, they are going to feel that. And it can be enough to dysregulate them. And often, because of the high sensitivity, they are protecting themselves from those feelings. And it can make them look like they're not feeling or they're callous. But most PDAers, or all PDAers, really feel deeply. Sometimes in some situations, they're too anxious to worry about the impact of their behavior on other people. So they might appear oblivious, but it's just they're trying to be okay and survive.
So a little bit about a meltdown. This was more, when I started learning about PDA, this was maybe 3.5 years ago. It was more talked about the external presentation, which would be like explosive, or in the school system throwing things, and so very obvious that something was going on. But there's also more internalized version of a meltdown as well. But either way, it's best to think of them as like a panic attack, that they're not voluntary, they're not a choice. They may or may not include aggression in the moment. So you might, if the aggression isn't being shown, either in the situation as it's happening, or if it's not being shown at home, a lot of internalized PDAers will turn it on themselves. So you'll see self-harm, or even by trying to control their eating, or by trying to find control somewhere else to sort of balance the scales. The inability to process language or troubleshoot isn't going to be there in the moment. Now, keeping in mind, I mentioned my oldest, who is kind of a little lawyer. He could use elaborate language. He could actually reason himself into a little circle. So what we're needing is not necessarily that you're not going to see the language or logic. It's that it becomes very narrow and focused and difficult to speak into. So you're not going to necessarily be able to resolve the tension right away. You might have to wait until things calm down, or they're in a safer situation, and then you can try to address what was going on, or troubleshoot it, so that you can help them for future situations. And go ahead, next slide. So yeah, I mentioned that internalized meltdowns, we've said a couple times, external, internal. So yeah, we're really just meaning, where is all that energy going? So if you think of it as just like, a ball of, I'm a very picture oriented person. So imagine it as like a flaming ball. An externalized would throw that ball, throw it at somebody else to try to resolve it. Whereas an internalized person might try to swallow that. They're swallowing it so that they're not causing problems, because to them that feels safer. It's not something that's been, parented into them. It's something that is usually just whatever their personality and instinct is. And Sally Cat talks a lot about internalized PDA, because that is definitely what she relates to the most. And did you want to say anything? Oh, no, you're good. Okay, go ahead.
That's trigger happy.
Yes.
I'm just going to talk a second about demands. We all know, kind of direct demands, like start your homework, wash your hands, those kind of things. The casual demand category, what Matt, stands out to me is that it can involve like fun things or things we think are fun, like let's go get ice cream or let's watch a movie, but there's still demands, which is important. And what I hadn't really thought about before I started working in the PDA field is that expectations are demands. So just following the rules of a game or just, school has all kinds of expectations. One PDA adult told me when he was a kid and would come downstairs in the morning before school, his mom would greet him and say, good morning. And just the expectation to say good morning back was enough to start his day off dysregulated, which I never thought returning a greeting would be hard, but of course it's a demand. And it, like we talked about before, self-imposed demands are still demands, wanting to do an activity and not being able to do it. So it could be eating, taking a shower, reading a book, anything, including talking. And this is something that's really hard and unique to PDAers.
So how are demands avoided? There's a lot of different ways. So again, you think about just like autism, where you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Same when it comes to PDA. The feelings and the triggers are similar, but the reactions are going to look a little different. So there's a variety of ways that we can try to avoid demands, from manipulation. And I know that's often seen as a dirty word or has been used in very negative ways, but I like to think of manipulation as like a survival strategy that our brains are trying to find a way to solve a problem. And with children, there's automatic power imbalance. Kids are not in a position to solve their own problems. Parents might not feel it, but automatically you can feel like an authority. So they'll try to manipulate the adults in their lives to try to get their needs met. Outright refusal, that they can't do it, or you can't make me. Excuses, my arms aren't strong enough, my legs are too weak. Distraction, arguing, negotiating, delaying, proposing alternative options, or even using make-believe. Go ahead. And this is, someone was talking about the F trauma responses. So we know the mainstream ones: fight, flight, freeze. Fawn has also been talked about more. Sally Cat added, I believe, I always forget which ones she had talked about first, but I think it was, I know it was Funster. So Funster could be the Joker. I have one of my kids who's like that, and very confusing. Again, very confusing for adults to see someone who's laughing and joking, but it's like uncomfortable. The energy from that is like, oh, this feels like a scary clown. But that's anxiety. It's an anxiety response under threat. Fawning doesn't just mean something we're going to talk about more in our book, but just explain here what I mean by fawning. I'm kind of a dominant fawner, so I relate to fawning in that the motivation is the same, even when I'm being controlling. My control is meant to try to fix something, usually fix a dynamic or fix a relationship inequality. I will try to be the teacher or try to control the situation. And then there's the submission form of fawning, where someone's just agreeing to whatever someone else is saying, but they're both, again, stress responses to try to make things calmer, which may or may not result in long-term help. Flopping, I get drowsy sometimes, involuntary, like drowsiness. We've heard of some kids who've outright passed out when under stress. Forgetting, that's another one that I struggle with too. I'll just go blank on things that I know very well. Actually, the first time I applied for like Social Security disability, I went through the whole examination. At the very end, he asked me what a movie was that I watched. What was the last movie I watched? And can I name an actor? And I couldn't. And he was like, it's actually still kind of traumatizing to me, because he was like, oh, come on. Like I was faking. And I was not faking. I couldn't think of a single actor in that moment, let alone the last one I just saw. fantasy. We've talked a little bit about that already. Just coming up with different characters or pretending to be an animal to escape responsibilities or whatever. Fibbing could be anything from outright lying to confabulation, which is where it's almost kind of borderline fib and fantasy. Confabulation is where the person actually believes the alternative explanation that's not true in their own mind. So yeah, these are just some different ways that we've seen PDA people, especially even kids, show these sophisticated ways of reacting to normal stress. And this is kind of what I just said, but written out for you guys. So you can go ahead.
So I'm going to talk a minute about the polyvagal theory. And hopefully some of you have heard of it. It's by Stephen Porges, and it's very relevant to PDA. And he talks about behavioral responses that represent how a person's nervous system constantly regulates the body's response to threat. So we all have like these survival instincts that live in 3 underlying states, right? So there's social engagement, and then there's defense, which is fight or flight, or life threat, which is shut down or freeze. And that is really kind of part of the evolutionary process to survive and thrive, and challenging behavior can be viewed as part of that. And he also talks about that all of us have this thing called neuroception. And neuroception is this subconscious surveillance of safety and threat in the environment. And PDAers have highly sensitive neuroception and perceives threat when other people don't feel like it's present. The other thing is that humans are wired for connection, and that is what makes us feel safe. So being isolated when we need connection, which is often a practice, doesn't make sense from a polyvagal standpoint. So if we really look at challenging behaviors for our kids or our clients, it's really that fight, flight, or freeze. So think about that when you think about the kids. All right, so from the majority of us view PDA as an autistic profile. We have talked about that. I do want to make the point that there are individuals who do not view it that way, who feel that you can be ADHD and PDA, or you can have PDA as a standalone diagnosis. So I just want to say there's different viewpoints. There's not a lot of research, so more research has to be done. And we are okay with people thinking the way they think, we at PDA North America. But we have noticed that PDAers share experiences and challenges like other autistic folks. So differences in the social arena, the sensory differences, interception, which is kind of understanding and reading your internal signals, your body signals, like hunger or thirst or having to go to the bathroom, or emotions. Anxiety is shared with other autistic individuals, and difficulty with emotional regulation as well. So now this is probably where people want to like wake up if you've been snoozing while you've been listening. We're going to talk about support, kind of the do's and don'ts. And the first one, which took me probably 4 years to understand, is that supporting PDA individuals is more about having a certain mindset or approach. It's less about using strategies. And I think in part because strategies can be used and they can be taken back. So they can be very inconsistent, where a mindset really drives the approach. And it's based on a genuine relationship. So that is kind of the big picture. There's things within that that are helpful, but nothing kind of replaces a trusting relationship. Things that are helpful to keep in mind is that everything can't be a priority. So really thinking and hopefully thinking about it collaboratively, what are the priorities? And giving control, letting a PDA individual plan their schedule and routines. We'll talk a little bit more about indirect language, including thinking aloud is something that can be very helpful. Being spontaneous, using humor if that works for the PDAer, and really listening to understand. Those things make a difference. And one of the things that I think of the most is just kind of forming a collaborative partnership as equals. And that can be sharing tasks, doing things with a PDA. You're being protective by having your nervous system co-regulate with their nervous system. Offering autonomy, because autonomy is like oxygen for most PDAers. And you have to approach things as equals, not you helping them. Keeping in mind that stress is cumulative and that our emotions are contagious. So if you are trying to support a PDAer, keeping that in check. I'm a believer in making empathetic statements, but they have to be genuine. And the individual has to believe that you are being genuine. And the individual has to be able to tolerate them too. So empathy, but be careful.
Some other ways of supporting, allowing them to behave in the ways that feel most comfortable. So of course you have to keep in mind safety and such. But for the most part, if you're noticing that you're in a situation and your child, or even as an adult, you find yourself maybe fawning or trying to get away or whatever, really it's just best to see those things as communication and as cues, and letting the child or letting the adult find kind of lead the way in finding safety. Helping things make sense. Sometimes you do just have to explain something so that they can see the reasoning behind it, and then that will make it accessible, because otherwise then it just feels like an arbitrary, command or power play, which does exist a lot in our culture. So if they understand the reasoning behind something, then it makes it more able to be done. It has to be worth the level of energy and stress. That can depend on the seasons they're in. Some are higher stress seasons where they can't tolerate as much, and some are better and they can tolerate more. Modeling how to understand ourselves. I find that, a lot of parents are freaked out when you talk about PDA sensitivities, and then it's like all this pressure, just feels like a lot of pressure on themselves to keep it all together all the time. But I try to shift the lens on that too and say, look, nobody can keep it together all the time. Nobody is perfect. And a lot of times, I'll just throw this out there. If you got a PDA kid, you might be a PDA adult, because we definitely see it happen in families. So we like to group together. And so just using, like for me, it actually started with myself. So my kids were not in burnout. I was in burnout. And then as I learned about how to help myself, I applied that to my children. And I also would communicate things like, well, this is hard for me because blah, blah, blah. And modeling is to me, it's one of the most low pressure ways to help teach somebody, because how much more authentic can that get, and how much more equalizing can that be, that you are starting with yourself. Teaching how you communicate about themselves and their needs. Again, I think it starts with yourself and your own communication, and then helping them to find the language or the supports that they need, depending on what it is they're going through. and not pressuring them, obviously, not pushing, and don't ignore. So we're not saying either, just, oh, leave them alone. So that's one of the downsides of the word autonomy. Sometimes people picture just letting the person do whatever they want to do all the time. And it's like, that's not really support either. It's more proactive than that. So you want to help things to become accessible to them as they're able to. It's really just relationship rooted, not strategy rooted. So,
Right. So just a few things to get more to keep in mind with supporting PDAers is that there's a lot of people before they knew about PDA kind of used Ross Greene's approach for tricky individuals. And um, one of the things I like about Russ Green is that he said that challenging behavior is only a sign or a signal that there's a problem. It's not the problem. So I remind myself of that all the time. What took me a long time to realize is that one of the reasons that behavioral approaches, including looking at antecedents, doesn't work is that antecedents are just the last straw and stress builds up over time. And also, it took me a long time to realize that individuals go from 0 to 60 sometimes because their baseline is 50 or 55. There are PDA individuals who have always been highly anxious and don't even know other people don't feel that way. And they've always felt that way. So it doesn't take much to, put them over the edge. And sometimes PDA kids work so hard to try to meet our needs and comply, and they use behaviors that I know myself thought were troubling in the past, like negotiating. I didn't see when a kid was negotiating that they were trying to make it work for them. Like if you say turn off the screen in 10 minutes and they say 20, that might be their way of being able to get off the screen. One of the other things we talk about a lot at PDA North America is, the expression is the juice worth the squeeze? Because every task for a PDA has to be worth the stress and energy. Everything has a cost. Things take a toll, so it needs to be calculated. And it's really great to have a partner to calculate these. Lastly on this slide is we know it's hard to support a PDAer and we can't always make things better, but we can avoid making things worse. And it is pretty easy to make things worse. I'm going to talk for a second about Julia Dont. She wrote a book with Ruth Fiedler called Being Julia. And one of her contributions, I think, is that in this book, she talks about needing recovery time and that her life is she has this recovery cycle that's a repeating pattern of preparing for an activity, coping for the activity, recovering from the activity, and then preparing for the next. And it can be a lengthy process, but she really needs recovery time. And I find that lots of PDA children and adults need recovery time, and our systems, our culture doesn't really allow for it. Kids are expected to go on time to school 5 days a week, and adults are expected to work 5 days a week. Here's my little nagging slide. So try to resist the urge to give consequences or threaten consequences, to worry about holding PDAers accountable, lecture or talk too much, dismiss their reality. We say things as adults like, oh, that's not true, or I don't think that's so. It doesn't work to dismiss reality. And when we're doing that, we're often trying to convince them otherwise. Like, oh, your math teacher's not that mean, or sometimes she's nice, or I don't think that person was trying to be unfair. Those things aren't helpful. It's also not helpful to remind PDAers of rules or expectations. If they are having trouble following a rule or expectation, it's generally not because they need a reminder. Try to resist expressing disappointment. And even though every professional and every parenting book says you need to process challenging behavior. You really don't need to. You don't have to talk about it after the fact. You can let it go and move on. They will give you another opportunity, and you can proactively try to support them. You don't need to talk about what went wrong. It generally just causes shame. And try not to get stuck on, if you're not giving a consequence or a talking to or processing it, you're letting them get away with it.
Mhm. Now a little bit about some of the hidden demands in even our language that people just don't think about. Um, but if you consider how we talk sometimes, go do this, go get that. There's a lot of imperative, urgency and specificity. Wow, that's a fun one. Specificity that goes into usually mainstream adulting or whatever, and it doesn't offer a lot of flexibility of choice. So declarative language. Linda Murphy wrote the book Declarative Language Handbook. She's wonderful, sweetest person on the planet. And so just some ways to adapt our language so that it doesn't feel as demanding or threatening. So you can think of it as like commenting out loud, making observations in a very neutral way. They're trying to avoid locking them into a specific outcome with the way we talk. Hold on. Okay, I got a child thing going on. So I will finish this. You want to finish? You know Linda Murphy, and I'm going to mute myself so you don't have to hear this. Okay.
Just something to practice for a while is using sentence starters like, I wonder, I noticed, I imagine, I'm thinking, I remember. So you're kind of putting it on yourself and just sharing a thought or an observation. It works really well, especially if it's genuine, and only really if it's genuine. Just gonna real quick, thinking about that, what we can see, like behavior, is just the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, that's where what we talk about the most, that's where we spend our time and our interventions on. And we don't give enough attention to all the things that are happening under the water, and demand anxiety, school history, sensory processing differences, social differences, medicine side effects, nutritional deficits, sleep disruptions. There's all kinds of things. And that's where we need to put in our supports. But that's not really what's natural in our kind of society that focuses on just the observable behavior. Oh, perfect timing. Talk about burnout, because that's what we're going to try to
There we
prevent.
go.
All right.
Yeah, so what is burnout? Run across burnout a lot. In fact, a lot of you might even be here because, this something with your child or with yourself became so intense that it no longer, you're in crisis, basically. So PDA burnout is when you're going to see the least capacity for doing things. Your personality changes at times. The intensity of mood swings are bigger. So think of it as, they have been trying for too long. And sometimes it can, again, like the 0 to 60 illustration that, it seems like it comes out of nowhere. Oftentimes it's because they have been pushing and masking and trying to get by for so long. And then all of a sudden that just falls apart. So I'm going to talk actually a lot about burnout, and my presentation at the conference this year is about burnout. But so just to keep it brief here, just recognize that if you've got a child that their capacity is, gone, basically, expect it to be it's a longer healing process. It's the lowest demands possible. And in fact, a lot of the advice you're going to get from professionals or even in like PDA parenting groups is going to be almost frightening, how low the demands go during that time. But just remembering it's meant to be a time of healing. And I think, looking at it through the eyes of equalizing helps me make sense of burnout too, because like I've been through burnout twice. And it's where I'm giving and giving and giving and giving. and, not listening to myself, and, just trying to meet external or internal expectations that might not suit who I am, or that obviously don't suit who I am. And then the healing time is like a time where you get all that back to yourself. Um, there's a lot of, with kids, it's thought of as a lot of tablet time usually, or they're playing their games all the time or whatever. I, as an adult, sat in front of my TV or laid in front of my TV for a long time, months, and it can be very discouraging, but it really is just a healing process. And then, you don't want to just go from, uh, burnout and retreating from life to right back into the situation that got you there. So burnout healing is also about figuring out how to live life differently, and how to live a life that best accommodates your child or yourself.
Great. And keeping cool can be the hardest part, right? So we can't expect the people we're supporting to be emotionally regulated if we're not. And sometimes that means we need to fight the punitive parts of ourselves. We need to practice self-care, and we need to just be honest when we're struggling, because we're human too, and we have a nervous system just like the PDA person we're supporting.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
We have some resources for you. We could talk so much more, but 15 minutes for questions, and it looks like there's a lot in the chat.
For us, that's pretty good. Usually we're jabbering on until.
I know. It's, yeah, because there was so much we didn't talk about that we want to talk about. I could go on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, that's why we have our level 1 training and our level 2 training professionals. And those trainings are, by the way, 3.5 hours each. So, well, the level 2 is actually a 5-hour training. But anyhow, I will jump into some questions here. I'm Ruth from PDA North America.
Do you want to continue recording, or do you want to stop?
Oh yeah, we probably should stop recording for questions in case. What do you think?
Sure. Okay.